Well, greetings. It is really good to be here. It truly is. It's a little bit bright, so I apologize. I can't see you very well. That is a super disorienting way of walking onto the stage, because when I give lectures and things like that to colleagues in my residence, it's a whole lot of silence. You stand up, no one says anything. You give your talk, no one says anything. You sit down, no one says anything. And so this is a little bit disorienting, but much appreciated. And you guys don't even know me. This could be the most boring talk you've heard so far. But I guess you just have a good attitude. So, okay, so we're gonna jump into this. You know what this is about? This is some of the science behind the mechanisms and effects of the lifelong vitality. Obviously, there's no way that we can go into every single detail. I really want you to know, I think it's fair to you that you know a little bit about who is standing up on the stage talking to you, and I really want to show you my family because they are absolutely amazing. So on the left, that's my son River. He's about to turn 6. He loves everything. He is a super genius boy. He loves to ride his mountain bikes and get them dirty and muddy, and he's always impressing us with what he can do on this old pump track that we have near our house. There in the middle is my incredibly beautiful and amazing wife, Katie, who many of you probably really do know. And our youngest daughter, Zoe, there, who's about to turn 2. And there on the right, that's Eliza. She's our middle daughter. She'll turn 4 in January. She's dressed up like a NASA astronaut because we all love space for the last Halloween. Just a couple more pictures. We're so fortunate. We live in East Tennessee, in Knoxville, Tennessee. It is paradise there. And we live really, really close to the Smoky Mountains, so we get to go play in the mountains and the streams and the rivers all the time. And there's River and Eliza throwing rocks and playing near the stream. And there's Eliza and I on a recent little daddy-daughter date. So anyway, I want you to know just a couple of really basic things about me. I'm an emergency physician, a board-certified emergency physician. I work at a major academic and trauma medical center, and I am honored to do what I do. I take it very seriously. I hope that you know that. I take it very seriously. I see it as a critical, necessary service to our community. I believe in it very much. And I have pretty strong academic inclinations. I spend a lot of time teaching residents and fellows from other specialties. I hope soon to spend a fair amount of time developing a emergency medicine residency program at our hospital. And the reason I'm telling you this is not because I'm trying to tote my credentials. In fact, I have the opposite sort of instincts here. But really just because I want you to know one simple thing, which is that I'm committed to my profession and I'm committed to my job. And that sets up the contradiction, because on the flip side of that, I have from the very beginning, even from when I was in college trying to decide if I even wanted to go to medical school, I've had this awareness of the inadequacies of the House of Medicine. And I don't mean to imply that it has a fatal or a fundamental flaw, just simply it does not tell the whole story when it comes to health. It cannot tell the whole story when it comes to health. And to that extent, I have long maintained an interest in, a passion for, sort of a more cumulative, comprehensive, cooperative approach to health that includes far more than just what the medical field and prescription pads and procedures can provide. So that's one of the reasons Katie and I have had felt so comfortably involved in doTERRA, I suppose. We are so thankful for their contributions to health, their evidence-based approach to their contributions to health, all the amazing health journeys we've been able to see in our time with doTERRA. And I really am appreciative that it provides me this other world that I can inhabit from time to time that is really far away from the blood and guts and pus and violence of the emergency department. So I'm really thankful to be here. Now, I think we probably need to just go ahead and jump into what we're talking about. Katie and I get to teach a lot about a lot of different things, and we love doing that. Without a question, one of the things that we get the most questions about is the LLV. There's just a lot of curiosity about it, a lot of questions come up. So I have spent a lot of time digging into these products just to understand What is in them? How does it work? What's the chemistry? What's the biology? Is there anything from an evidentiary standpoint to substantiate just this preponderance of anecdote? You hear so much. People describe such positive experiences with the LLV, and the scientist in me, and I am a consummate nerd, I am just a transcendent nerd, the scientist in me just wants to know how and why and kind of get into the machine of it. So a couple quick caveats. The first thing is we're not going to spend a lot of time doing what I call product differentiation. So I'm not going to be trying to sort of describe what is fundamentally different about this product as compared to another product or anything like that. I really am just here to sort of be your geek, and I'll be the most committed geek you've ever seen. The other caveat is, as Rob was alluding to, there are hours and hours and hours and hours of material when it comes to really elaborating, I think, to a justifiable extent on the LLV and a lot of its constituents. And so we just can't talk about every single constituent. We can't do a deep dive literature review on every single one here. So necessarily I'm going to have to leave some things out, unfortunately. So if you really, really want to hear about boswellic acids, something I'm passionate about, we're not going to have time to go into that, or curcumin, or some of these other ingredients. So what I've done instead is to try and pick what I consider to be the highest yield, I think the most critical elements to the biology here and to the biochemistry, and I'm trying to really drill down on that so you can walk away with some usable information. So the first thing I'm going to do really quick is to try and reorient our definitions a little bit, because I'm going to use a word here in a minute that is associated with a lot of baggage, and I want to try my best to eliminate that baggage so we can get ourselves all on the same page, and that word is nutrition. So when I say that word, I think it conjures up hundreds, if not thousands, of different definitions and impressions and gestalt emotions. Some people love that word, some people hate that word. Some people want to stay as far away from it as they can. Some people want to come as close to it as they can. To some it means carbs, other it means calories. To some it means muscle mass or their waistline or their feelings about their physique and all that stuff. And there is no singular definition of nutrition. It just doesn't exist. But to the extent that there's so much variability in this room, I want to try and get us to coalesce around a singular definition, because it really does need to provide a context moving forward. So this is where we kind of jump into it. So this is where I need you to really kind of dig in and pay attention. So this is a bit of a mouthful, and this is my definition of nutrition, which is the dry, rather soulless, mechanical act, having nothing to do with emotions, nothing to do with your taste buds, just the mechanical act of getting the right nutrients and inputs into your cells and tissues in order to optimize their function, okay? So, in that context, you're not feeding your waistline or anything like that. You're feeding the individual cells of your body in order to optimize their function. You're feeding the cells that comprise your neurologic systems and your cardiovascular systems and things like that. And you want them to do their jobs as optimally as possible. And for that to be the case, you have to optimize their nutrition, their inputs, their environment, and so on. So optimal nutrition in my book can be redefined as cellular nutrition. So if you're able to optimize the nutrition at the cellular level, then and only then, I believe, you have the greatest chance of optimizing the function of your essential biology, okay? So I say that because that is the context that we have to embed a really thorough understanding of what the LLV is up to, because it does tackle a fundamentally different target than what you might be used to hearing about, okay? So, a lot to say, we got to move on. I'm going to jump first into the microplex and the Z omega. And the reason for that is, number one, I think it provides a really nice template to sort of highlight some of these physiological principles. And the second is they're a little easier to understand. They're pretty simple at their core. And I do want to try and relieve you of the burden of feeling like there's anything inherently complicated about these products, because really and truly, if we can kind of come back to the surface here, at their core, this is a multivitamin and an omega-3 supplement. And obviously there's a lot of really interesting stuff that's thrown in to kind of add to the uniqueness and the potency of them. But at their core, it's a multivitamin and an omega-3 supplement. So we'll just kind of start there and expand. The first concept I really want to nail down for you is the critical importance of balance when it comes to cellular physiology. So in a lot of ways and in a lot of circumstances, your body is way more interested in having balance of its inputs and materials and nutrients and things like that, rather than the absolute amount. The absolute amount matters insofar as you might have way too many or way too few, but as long as you're within those physiologic parameters, then it's really, really interested in balance, okay? The problem is, I think it's probably not too far away from obvious. The problem is a lot of us don't spend a lot of time within those reasonable physiological parameters. So we'll begin with the omega. It's a nice kind of starting point here. So as I said, at its core, the omega-3, or the Z-omega is really just an omega-3 supplement. And that's important for a couple of distinct reasons. And the first is that omega-3s are good for you in their own right. It's pretty simple. They're just good for you. But way more importantly, and this is where I want to spend the majority of our time, the omega-3, or what's more important than that is the fact that your body is unfortunately accustomed to a profoundly lopsided intake of omega-6 fatty acids as compared to omega-3s. So let's elaborate. Your body is way more interested in that ratio than it is, again, in the absolute amount of either. So both omega-6s and 3s cannot be made endogenously. They cannot be manufactured by your body. They are dependent on what you get through your diet, okay? So omega-6s, the problem with them is that they're way too easy to get. They're in basically everything that the average American eats day in, day out, multiple times a day. They're in most vegetable oils, they're in grain-fed or kind of cheaper meats, they're in conventional eggs, they're in processed food, they're everywhere, okay? So you can get way too many of them totally unintentionally. By comparison, omega-3s are substantially harder to get. They're not impossible by any stretch of the imagination, but they come from more unique sources. So the two most physiologically powerful and important omega-3s are EPA and DHA, and they primarily come from marine sources, things like salmon, tuna, herring, mackerel, anchovies, things like that. I love salmon. I eat it as much as possible, but it's kind of unique. ALA is also another important omega-3. It's a little easier to get, but it definitely trends more towards the hippie spectrum of foods, where you're eating lots of walnuts and flax seeds and hemp seeds and things like that, and plus some excellent vegetables like Brussels sprouts, kale, and spinach. It's a good one. It's not quite as powerful as EPA and DHA, but it's a good one nonetheless. So here's where the consequences start to accumulate. We get a ton of omega-6 fatty acids totally unintentionally and involuntarily, just by eating sort of like a regular human being here in America. And even if you're trying to get omega-3 fatty acids, it's still hard to get enough. So we're left with this bereft, lopsided ratio where we get 10, 15, 20, or even 30 times more omega-6s than omega-3s, when your body really wants that to be a balanced, neutral ratio. So we are way out of balance if we eat like the average American, okay? And again, I keep putting emphasis on diet because we don't make these. They are completely dependent on what we put in our bodies. So it really is what you're eating that matters so much. So if we fall out of this neutral ratio, real consequences start to accumulate. And if you're curious about where on the spectrum of falling out of balance things start to accumulate, it's when we get to around a ratio of 3 or 4 or 5 to 1. That's where the studies start to indicate that we start to actually see measurable consequences. And as you can see, we're way more than that. So one of the consequences is that omega-6s and omega-3s both require access to the same metabolic enzymes. And if you have 15 times more 6s than 3s in the game, then it is an unfair competition. So imagine like a soccer game where you have 15 players playing against one player on the other team. You obviously know who's going to win. So this sets up a real disadvantage for omega-3s, and even if you do sprinkle in some 3s kind of on top of this, they are not able to get access to their metabolic pathways the way that they need to, and it impairs their effectiveness, it impairs their utilization. Probably more important than that, though, is this, and this language is intentional, okay? And I'll define the terms here in a minute. But excessive or disproportionate omega-6 consumption invariably, inevitably, and obligatorily, just based on the physiology, leads to dramatically increased expression of pro-inflammatory cytokines. So cytokines, you may have already heard, you may already know this, cytokines are little signal molecules or messenger molecules that are sent out to send messages of a variety of different natures. Pro-inflammatory cytokines are little signal molecules that are sent out saying, hey, there's a problem here, we need to recruit some help to the area. And so inappropriate or excessive omega-6 consumption compared to omega-3 consumption, again, just based on the chemistry, absolutely obligatorily results in the release of way more pro-inflammatory cytokines than we need. And this sets up a real problem. In this case, these messenger molecules are bombarding your body incessantly with what are functionally distress signals. They are constantly, non-stop sparking inflammatory cascades, keeping them going like a perpetual motion machine. And we generally eat 2 to 5 times a day, and if we eat like we normally do, then what happens is we basically are just volunteering our hand to keeping this motion machine, this merry-go-round of bad physiology just spinning and spinning and spinning. Now, acute inflammation is a good thing, okay, if it's appropriately activated and if it's proportionate to whatever the problem is and if it's appropriately terminated on time. Chronic inflammation, though, is a completely different story. It is exhausting to your body, it is beleaguering, and it is confusing, and the consequences are massive. A really good way of exemplifying this is by talking about the metabolic syndrome, which is a term that many of you may know, some of you may not, especially in your encounters with physicians. The reason for that isn't because we're trying to keep the metabolic syndrome from you, but because we generally try to be a little more specific with our patients and talking about some of the individual diseases that kind of lay within the world of the metabolic syndrome. But you would recognize this. This is diabetes, high blood pressure, cholesterol and lipid derangements, vascular disease, a strongly increased predisposition to cancer, obesity and weight problems, cognitive dysfunction, and even poor emotional health and behavioral health. And chronic inflammation is not the only cause of the metabolic syndrome. I don't want you to get that impression, but it is a cause, and it is a consequence of it. It is part and parcel with it. It is just part of the milieu, so to speak, of the metabolic syndrome. On top of that, and this is really a key point, your immunologic system and function and your inflammatory system and function are deeply and inextricably intertwined, okay? They are not exactly the same thing, but they rely on a lot of the same machinery, and there is so much overlap. It's sort of like what we just had with the eclipse. It's like a near total eclipse, okay? If you were to do the Venn diagram of the inflammatory system and the immunologic system, they would overlap in a pretty profound way. So your inflammatory and your immunologic systems are inextricably interrelated. And so if you have chronic, inappropriately activated, and disproportionate inflammation going on, if your inflammatory cascades are just spinning and spinning and spinning, then that takes a real toll on your immune system and function. And so in practice, both in practice and in terms of the evidence, when you're subjected to a chronic inflammatory state, we consider you to be functionally immunocompromised, meaning that you have a impaired immunologic response to injury and infection. On top of that, your immune system gets a little confused about what it's doing and why it's doing it, and you have an increased predisposition to certain rheumatologic diseases and conditions. And then, as Rob was indicating, you also have a lot of chronic pain and chronic fatigue that doesn't necessarily have a specific name or diagnosis or ICD-10 code associated with it, but you feel it nonetheless, okay? So real consequences to chronic inflammation. Now, I just want to pause for a minute and make sure that you're not getting the impression that a lopsided ratio of omega-6s to 3s is the only cause of chronic inflammation, because it's not. And I also don't want to give the impression that if you just balance that ratio, whether it's because you eat a bunch of salmon or you take the Z-omega, then all of these problems will go away, because neither of those are true statements. But I definitely want you to understand that this is a concrete example of a concrete phenomenon with concrete consequences, okay? All right. So you've probably deduced the rest. The Z-omega is attempting to try and balance this ratio, both by providing an excellent stream of omega-3 fatty acids, but also it needs to work in conjunction with you voluntarily decreasing your consumption of omega-6 fatty acids and try and bring us as close to this neutral 1-to-1 ratio as we can possibly get. That is what the body yearns for, and that's what we want to give it. So just like the consequences of a lopsided ratio are concrete, so are the benefits of a balanced ratio. And you could probably get these based on the pathophysiology that we just discussed. So to a certain extent, we see reduced triglyceride levels in people taking omega-3 fatty acids or have a higher increased intake of omega-3 fatty acids. It sort of depends on the person and their age and other diseases and things like that. But more importantly, as importantly, or I guess depending on who you are, more importantly, we also see a general tuning down of this chronic inflammatory state, and the benefits are pretty widespread, including what we have observed as a reduced risk for developing cardiovascular disease and cerebrovascular disease. And again, the degree to which it reduces your risk is extremely variable, but we have definitely observed that risk. We see improved mental health, behavioral health, cognitive health. We also see improved bone and joint health and reductions in this admittedly vague but profoundly impactful nonetheless situation where you have chronic pain and chronic fatigue, okay? So I hope you can kind of see what's happening here. This is cellular nutrition. This has nothing specifically to do with your waistline or your resting heart rate or any other sort of surface level marker of your health or fitness. This, instead, is a pure attempt to optimize the function of your essential biology at its most fundamental level. Okay, so a fundamentally different approach. So we're going to try and blow through this because we don't have a lot of time, but so it is with vitamins and minerals, and this is where we're going to try and keep things a little short because this is much easier to understand. Vitamins. We've all heard, that you should eat your vitamins, take your vitamins, eat so you get your vitamins, and I think we all sort of, even if we don't take vitamins, I think we all sort of intuit the underlying importance of doing this, and the reason for that is that these are essential ingredients for all these biochemical reactions and pathways and cellular processes that are constantly, every nanosecond of your existence, occurring not on the macro level, but on the micro level, at the cellular level, okay? So you probably didn't realize it, but if you're taking vitamins, you are living out what I'm talking about, which is trying to tend to your cellular health, okay? This is a beautiful example of tending to your cellular health. All right. Now, just like your body likes your omega-3s and your omega-6s in a certain ideal ratio, it likes the same thing when it comes to vitamins and minerals. So your physiology really does have a defined preference for optimal ranges of each of these, and we have every reason to expect that your cellular biology has the highest likelihood of working optimally when these nutrients are available in these balanced levels, in these reasonable levels. And it's with that attitude that doTERRA has formulated the microplex, and this is something I appreciate so much. They have really eliminated that more is always better sort of approach to the formulation here, and instead they've prioritized balance. So I cannot tell you from just a sheer, just raw physiologic perspective how much I appreciate that. The second thing I want to take just a brief moment to explain is the importance of how these vitamins and minerals and nutrients are presented to the body. This isn't going to take a long time. I think you'll get the point here in just a moment. When you eat an orange, you're taking in more than just vitamin C, even though that's what the orange is sort of legendary for providing, okay? When you eat blueberries, you're taking in more than just its antioxidants and its fiber. When you take in when you take in carrots, you're taking in a lot more than just vitamin K, even though, again, that's what sort of steals the headlines when it comes to carrots. When you bite into an apple, you are obtaining a cloud of vitamins and minerals and enzymes and coenzymes and cofactors and catalysts and fiber. All of these things contribute to your body actually recognizing it as food and assimilating it and using it appropriately, okay? It helps it adhere to the digestive lining of your intestinal tract, helps it be absorbed, recognized, utilized exactly the way that it's supposed to. So this is why I think doTERRA's taken the extra time to appreciate the chemistry here, and they've really prioritized formulating these in a way and presenting them to the body in a way that your body's actually going to recognize it as food instead of just distilling it down to the molecule, filling a capsule, and handing it to you, okay? So really, really important. Now, I've reserved the rest of the time for alpha CRS. And admittedly, I'm going to go a little bit long here. I hope that doesn't offend anyone. I think we were running ahead of schedule before. But this is where we get this is where we get the most questions, and this is where we have the most curiosity. And this is the one I find most fascinating and unique. So this is where I really want to kind of park and talk about it. So doTERRA refers to the alpha CRS as its cellular vitality complex, which is really a nod towards its target, which is the cell. And this is one of the purest examples of an all-out effort to optimize cellular nutrition and cellular health as I've really yet seen. And that's one of the main reasons why I like talking about it and teaching about it so much. So if you look up the product information page on the alpha CRS, it says it does tons and tons and tons of things. And so I don't want to do a discredit to that by simplifying it too much. But I have definitely found that if we can kind of distill it down to two overriding sort of primary objectives, then it makes it a whole lot easier to digest and a whole lot easier to understand. So the alpha CRS, yes, it does a lot of things, but I think it's safe to say the two primary objectives are these. One is to enhance cellular energy production, and the other is to defend the cell, particularly against oxidative damage and oxidative stress. So we're going to talk about cellular energy production first. And to do that fairly, we have to kind of differentiate between two concepts, and we're going to circle back to it in a minute. The first is exogenous provision of energy, which is not an ideal circumstance, because what that means is essentially you're providing sources of energy sort of as a stimulant to your body that it cannot and does not manufacture itself. And it's sort of like caffeine. Caffeine's a good example. You take it in, it tickles some receptors for a few minutes or a few hours. It makes you feel like your body's kind of coursing with energy for a little bit, and then unfortunately it's not sustainable. It leaves you kind of depleted afterwards. There's nothing substantive about it. In contradistinction to that, you have this endogenous production of energy, which is basically the simple fact that your body comes already well equipped with profoundly powerful mechanisms to create and manufacture its own energy, and I think you would agree with me that that's a preferable place to apply our efforts. That's where we want to work. So your body has all sorts of mechanisms to create energy, tons and tons of different mechanisms to create energy, but without question, one of the most important is the energy production pathway that's found in the mitochondria. These really are your first line bioreactors. They're near ubiquitous. They're in virtually every single cell of your body. And they produce energy, as Rob was alluding to, through a very complex, elegant series of biochemical reactions that, just for the sake of simplicity, so we don't have to describe every reaction, this has a name. This series of biochemical reactions has a name, and it's called the mitochondrial respiration. Okay? This is a really good example of a process that's highly input dependent. So for mitochondrial respiration to function optimally, your bioreactors, the mitochondria, have to be supplied with the correct inputs and the correct machinery, and ideally both in abundance. And that's where the alpha CRS really kind of goes to work. So as Rob was alluding to earlier, and by the way, I'm so thankful that he did his talk the way that he did, because I think he laid really an effective and beautiful kind of framework and foundation for you kind of understanding this, and it allows us a little bit of a safer opportunity to go a little bit deeper. So he mentioned a lot of compounds that are involved with this. As I told you before, we're not going to be able to talk about everything, but I did want to spend some time on these three because I think they're particularly instructive. So let's start with coenzyme Q10. It's a complex molecule. It's found basically everywhere, but particularly in the mitochondria. It sits physically right on the inner membrane of the mitochondria, which is where the process of mitochondrial respiration occurs. And it doesn't play just sort of an important or supportive role. It plays an essential, indispensable, critical role in the process of mitochondrial respiration. So the basic idea here, and we'll elaborate more on this in a minute, but the basic idea here is that you're sort of enriching the environment in which the mitochondria have to function. You're basically providing what is hopefully a healthy amount of these critical factors involved in this biochemical reaction to enhance its output and enhance its efficiency. Alpha lipoic acid is really, really instructive. Okay, so we'll say ALA for short, so we don't have to say that the whole time. It's been studied for a lot of different things, but we're going to kind of try to constrain our thoughts here. It is a critical cofactor, which you can think of as being an assist molecule, kind of like a sous chef in a kitchen. It's a critical cofactor for these what's called mitochondrial respiratory enzyme complexes. And these are the molecules that actually do the work, or most of it, of energy production in this process of mitochondrial respiration. So these enzyme complexes you can think of as being sort of the robots at the car assembly factory. Like if you've seen pictures of the GM factory, or the Tesla factory, or whatever, these are the big robots that do a lot of the work of assembling the car. Okay, so ALA is a major assist molecule or cofactor for these enzyme complexes, all right? Now, the question for the scientists has not been whether or not ALA is important for mitochondrial respiration. That is clear. The question really is whether targeted or strategic supplementation with ALA does anything measurable to increase mitochondrial output. Okay, that's a different concept. So you can measure this a variety of different ways, and I've been kind of debating about how deep to go into this, but it turns out that it can. And I think it's probably relevant for us to mention a couple of the different ways. So I mentioned to you that the process of mitochondrial respiration occurs primarily on the membrane, okay, on the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Well, you can actually measure the health of that membrane by measuring something called the mitochondrial membrane potential. So you can imagine if that membrane is kind of broken down or decaying, then you're not going to have, or that would be surrogate evidence of the fact that that process is sort of becoming beleaguered or broken down. And you can measure this, and it turns out ALA supplementation does indeed improve the mitochondrial membrane potential. You can also directly measure the output or the activity of those respiratory enzyme complexes, and it turns out ALA supplementation improves their output. And you can also measure something called mitochondrial oxygen consumption, which is an indicator of sort of the output of this whole process, and it turns out that ALA supplementation does indeed improve that as well. So this has been demonstrated. It's pretty exciting. On top of that, there is some preliminary data, and I don't want to overdo it here. There is some preliminary data that suggests that ALA supplementation may actually enhance this process called mitochondrial biogenesis. Biogenesis is a fancy way of saying making more, so more mitochondria. Where this really becomes interesting is, Rob already told you that as a natural process of aging, through no fault of anyone's, you have a decline in the function and the number of your mitochondria. And that is problematic for a superfluity of reasons. And it would be really, really nice to be able to find a way to either slow that process down or actually create more mitochondria so the consequences of what would otherwise be mitochondrial decay are not felt to such a dramatic degree. And there is some preliminary data that suggests that ALA may very well do that. Now, to what degree, we don't know exactly yet. One thing I would say, I would be remiss in not mentioning this, is that there is one thing that we do know that absolutely 100% stimulates mitochondrial biogenesis, and there is no debate about it whatsoever, and that is exercise. So that is one of the reasons why exercise is so much more important than just trying to balance out the mathematics of your calories in versus calories out. There is such a physiologic importance to exercise, but that's a different topic for another day. Okay, the last one we're going to talk about is acetyl L-carnitine, or ALCAR for short. This is one that I actually already have a fair amount of baseline familiarity with because I use a very similar molecule therapeutically in some very specific clinical circumstances in the world of toxicology, which I deal with pretty frequently in emergency medicine. So I really enjoy it. In fact, I give a lecture to the residents from time to time on this molecule and when to use it. It's a little bit tricky and interesting. But this is another molecule that sits right there on the mitochondrial membrane and is integral to the function and the process of mitochondrial respiration. And its job is to help kind of shuttle some fatty acids into these energy-producing pathways. There's no debate about that. So again, the question is targeted supplementation with ALCAR been demonstrated to improve mitochondrial function or output? And again, it seems that it has. So one way that we've looked at, this has been looked at a lot of different ways, but one way that we've seen is that ALCAR supplementation has been demonstrated to increase mitochondrial mass and structure. So basically they're stronger and more robust and a little bit larger. They're not starting to break down and kind of decay. And then there's also some evidence that, again, it's preliminary, that it may increase mitochondrial biogenesis, which is pretty exciting. Now, even if, and again, the data is looking hopeful when it comes to biogenesis, but even if for some reason some study comes out showing that it doesn't really do that, one thing that we know for sure is that ALCAR supplementation attenuates or slows down that natural process of decline that I already told you about that comes with aging. So really, really nice effect there. So let's we've been in the forest for a little bit, or we've been, in the trees. We need to step back and kind of remind ourselves where we are in the forest. And kind of take a look at this. The biochemistry's all been worked out. It's as concrete as you can imagine. And there is a steady, kind of constant flow of emerging human level and clinical data demonstrating that the consequences are as expected based on the biochemistry. So it's a pretty exciting time. Again, the alpha CRS is not designed to function like a stimulant. The goal instead is to create a sustained, deep level effect, again, by nourishing your essential biology on the cellular level, okay? So a totally different approach. I think a good allegory to this is like composting the soil. There's probably some gardeners in the room. I love doing that. I've unfortunately been the victim of some really beleaguered, spent, nutrient void, structureless garden soil, and you just don't get good product out of that. You don't get good plants. They're not particularly vigorous. But you mix a bunch of compost into that soil and do a little top dressing with compost, and what you're doing is you're adding in all these extra nutrients. You're inviting this new microculture to come up in the soil. All of a sudden the worms come back and the root structure improves, and it's not something you notice overnight, okay? It's not something you notice by the end of the afternoon that you laid the compost. It's something you notice in the next growing season when you have more tomatoes and blueberries than you ever had before, and the plants are way sturdier, they get more growth out of it, they flower more robustly, and they're more drought tolerant, etc., etc. So it's a really good example. We're enriching that mitochondrial environment. We're sort of composting them. So I hope that makes sense to you. Now the second mechanism, we're stepping out of the first, which is all about cellular energy production, and we're now going to visit the cellular defense side of this. And again, its main defense mechanism is antioxidants. So Rob already did a really good job talking about this, so I won't belabor the point. But you can think of as antioxidants as essentially being molecular disruption machines. They basically are very unfair in the way they induce instability in neighbor molecules and sets off this extremely destructive chain reaction that can result in a lot of problems. One of them is like destroying certain compounds in the cell wall, which can actually lead to cell death, which is actually a little bit less consequential than it sounds. It sounds a whole lot more horrifying than it is. Where we really get concerned, though, is if we see damage to your genetic material. And your genetic material lives in a couple of different places, your cell's nucleus and also the mitochondria. And that's what we really worry about. That's what we want to protect at all costs. So the name that we give to the consequences of these free radical molecules is oxidative stress. And it is one of the mechanisms behind chronic inflammatory states, cardiovascular disease, some of the mechanisms of aging, cancer, especially when you get abnormalities in the code of the genetic material involved. So you can think of oxidative stress as carrying out just a constant, relentless cellular assault on your cells, and therefore it becomes a major target of the alpha CRS. And the way that it does this is by trying to make peace, not war, and it brings peace with these antioxidants. And Rob already explained to you how, so I won't belabor the point. So it's no secret that alpha CRS provides a whole bunch of antioxidants that are extremely well evidence-based and supported, and pretty unique, actually, and we're going to dip into that a little bit. But what's interesting is not necessarily the fact that it provides you antioxidants, it's how it does this that I find so fascinating. And this is where we're going to try and bring it full circle. So you have all these different sources of oxidative stress, from the air you breathe to UV rays you're exposed to, stress, whether it's emotional or physiologic, or even physical stress like excessive exercise can induce a lot of oxidative stress, illness, can induce oxidative stress, and then of course things you might do to yourself, like eating a lot of processed foods, taking certain medications, tobacco smoking, and things like that. But, as Rob alluded to, oxidative stress also results from the perfectly normal cellular processes that are occurring constantly, including mitochondrial respiration. But the key here is that your body has really nice compensatory mechanisms as long as the mitochondria are appropriately fueled and they're not stressed out. But when you have stressed out, decaying, inadequately fueled or inadequately nourished or decreased amount of mitochondria, if they're stressed out, then they create a lot of oxidative pollution that becomes very consequential. So this is what causes us to revisit the need to support these mitochondria and prevent that from happening to begin with. So because stressed out mitochondria create all this oxidative pollution, we should obviously try to alleviate that stress as much as possible. And that's where things like coenzyme Q10, ALA, Alcar, quercetin, and things like that keep things running as smoothly as possible. So it works on the preventive end. But it gets even more interesting because, as it turns out, coenzyme Q10, ALA, and Alcar also function as powerful antioxidants in their own right. So we have this incredible circumstance where by providing these compounds, you are actually cleaning up while you are powering the factory, which is pretty unique, I think, if you look out sort of on the world and how it functions at large. So really, really neat the way that that works. And then on top of that, there's tons and tons of well-validated, very powerful, evidence-based polyphenol antioxidants that they include in here. The one thing I want you to know about this, and I really do wish we could go into depth on each one, but obviously we don't have the time to do that. But this is not just some random hodgepodge of sort of popular antioxidants. This is a very well substantiated, evidentiarily selection of antioxidants. And one of the neatest things about it is that in a lot of circumstances, not only do they function as antioxidants directly, but they also increase your body's own ability to manufacture or recycle your own antioxidants, which is excellent. So you've probably seen the list. Rob mentioned several of them: Biclin, resveratrol. These are definitely ones that improve the recycling of the antioxidants. and endogenous manufacture. And then other ones found in turmeric, like curcumin. That's a particularly fascinating one, but we'll move on. So again, the two objectives of the alpha-CRS we'll summarize in closing. Number one, to enhance cellular energy production, and the other is to defend the cell against oxidative damage and stress. So really fundamentally different approach from what you may very well be used to. Its idea is to optimize your nourishment on the cellular level. It's not a get thin quick sort of thing. It's not a hot wire your brain sort of thing. It tends to your cells at the most basic level. Okay? So, some of the consequences. We'll skip through this so we can get to this last slide. The idea here is to basically create what I like to call a physiologic ripple effect, whereby starting down here at the cellular level and improving its function, you're then able to optimize the function of the systems that they're next most involved with, and then larger systems, and then larger systems, and larger systems, and eventually it gets to the point where it really does affect and change how you function and feel as you're sitting there in your chair, okay? So there's two kind of tiers of benefit. You have your short-term benefit where you feel sharper, you have more energy, you're less prone to those crashes, you feel less fatigue and stress and pain and things like that. But where I really get more interested in this is in the long-term effects. I think this is the grander vision. This is where Rob was talking about this compression of morbidity. This is why I get excited about it, because as thankful as I am for the fact that my caffeine requirements have seriously withered and I feel a whole lot better at 3 o'clock in the afternoon than I used to, et cetera, what I'm really focusing on is how I'm going to feel when I'm 50 if I keep this kind of thing up. That's what I'm most interested in. I don't want to be subjected to chronic disease and basically just sort of tame it and keep it subdued. I don't want to enter that territory at all, ever to begin with, okay? And again, it's part of a healthy lifestyle. You can't do this all by yourself. I just want to remind you, exercise and eating clean and things like that are critically important. So I really appreciate all your time. Sorry we went over a little bit. I really hope you can take some of that and go with it. And thanks very much.